Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajmeen. Welcome, alhamdulillah, to Legacy Discussions, Ijtihad and Taqlid Evolved, connecting classical theory with our modern world. We're joining, inshallah, with Sheikh Ismail Patel, who's a very good friend, alhamdulillah, and we're going to be speaking about this tense topic, which often brings a lot of confusion to many people. They don't understand how the dichotomy works between many people who maybe ascribe to things like madhabs, and how does that influence scholastic innovation, and we mean by that scholastic creativity, as well as understanding how to balance the classical terminologies of what's found in fiqh texts with the modern world and its application in our time. We're joined with Sheikh Ismail Patel, who was born and raised in Dewsbury, Yorkshire, where he currently resides as well. And he completed Tahfidh at the age of 13 and enrolled in the Institute of Islamic Education in Dewsbury. He studied the basics Arabic and higher Islamic education for 6 years, and then decided to leave for the Islamic University of Medina, where he graduated in 2007 with a BA honors from the Faculty of Sharia. And then he went on to read comparative commercial law and Islamic succession law for a master's at the University of London, which he completed in 2008. He's authored a couple of books in Arabic, morphology, as well as translating and giving some commentary on the Hanafi law primer known as Mukhtasar al-Quduri or Al-Kitab in the Hanafi Madhhab. He plans to author on the areas of his research interests and has previously taught at Ibrahim College and Tayyibun Institute in East London, and has given lectures in different parts of the world as well. His interests include reconstruction of the various aspects of advanced Islamic sciences and their development, including Hanafi jurisprudence, Ijtihad and Taqlid, the concept of weak hadith in Islam and its study, intra-Muslim comparative theology, and the canonized Quranic recitations. So without further ado, we welcome Sheikh Ismail Patel. Ahlan wa sahlan, Habib. كيف الحال?
السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. How are you?
Good to have you, alhamdulillah. Jazakumullah khair. So first and foremost, just to start off, what made you interested in this particular field? I mean, what led you to want to study in depth and research on Ijtihad and Taqlid? What was the cause for that, or precursor?
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله وحده والصلاة والسلام على من لا نبي بعده وبعد. First of all, Jazakallah for inviting me to Legacy and for me to be able to share some thoughts of mine with regards to this topic, which in this day and age has become significant somewhat due to the ever-changing world we are living in. So my interest in the topic of Ijtihad and Taqlid goes back to my interest in the general subject of Usul al-Fiqh. Obviously, Usul al-Fiqh is split into various parts where the jurists discuss various aspects with regards to the fundamentals of fiqh, such as the sources of Islamic law, which are mainly for Quran, Sunnah, consensus, and analogy. And then there's also the tools of the jurists by which they derive laws from these primary sources. And at the end of most usul texts, there is a discussion on Ijtihad and Taqlid, outlining basically the responsibilities of a Muslim, whether they are scholars or non-scholars, with regards to how they deal with the evidences. Do they go directly to the Quran and Sunnah, or do they go through a medium, i.e. books or scholars? So my interest in this field in particular is goes back to some articles that I came across around a decade ago, in which there was some assumptions made by some authors with regards to the particular aspect of taqlid, in which there were many restrictions and stipulations laid out for Muslims, not only in the West, but worldwide. So I went back to the sources, trying to identify where these restrictions and stipulations came from. And it turned out that whereas there was some precedent for them, but it wasn't the majority opinion of scholars from the past. So I basically went through a reconstruction form of research with regards to the specific aspect of taqlid and how, when, where, and in which contexts such stipulations with regards to taqlid were put down and why they were done. Basically, taqlid is the following of authority, the following of scholars for people who haven't studied the Quran and Sunnah. So are there any stipulations or are there any restrictions with regards to taqlid or not? So that is how I was introduced to this subject. Coincidentally, I see that this both Ijtihad and Taqlid, although there is some emphasis given to them in Islamic pedagogy across Islamic universities and colleges across the world. However, there are many colleges that don't actually teach them at an advanced level. Either they're taught at a basic or an intermediate level. But because the chapters of Ijtihad and Taqlid are found towards the end of Usul texts, not many students and graduates actually get to specialize within these fields. So I feel there is an importance, especially in this era, that all students of knowledge are familiar with the laws, the stipulations, the regulations surrounding Ijtihad and Taqlid, especially in this world where there's a lot of change happening. There is a lot of advancement in technologies, and there are questions surrounding whether Ijtihad, which is deriving rules from the Quran and Sunnah, is that even allowed or applicable in this day and age, and who is able to do that?
Great. And one of the things that you mentioned, I think that's incredibly important, is, subhanAllah, this same chapter, which is, as you mentioned, studied in the later portions of the Usul al-Fiqh, Islamic legal theory or Islamic legal jurisprudence, I found that, subhanAllah, it answered so many questions once a student of knowledge or a person on the path of scholarship actually learns. And I realized also personally that if, in fact, it was taught at a rudimentary level, at least cursory to the average Muslim, it would help them navigate so much in their life, from understanding what element of scholastic opinion is compulsive or is lazim in that essence incumbent upon them to follow, or what is not an obligation for them to follow, what choice they have to seek a scholarly opinion, and also determining who's qualified and who's not, who to listen to. I mean, as now the chaos that's happening with terms of YouTube people coming up, and even people on Twitter, they may have followings of 100,000 plus, but you can clearly see that they don't have the the foundations of understanding fiqh at a even rudimentary level for them to be even giving fatwa. So one of the things that actually, for me, that was very powerful is, why don't we study this in the beginning? And if we did that, it would actually help almost like chart a course, and also give scholastic literacy by teaching average people, an average Muslim, what it is they need to know to follow a scholar in their ijtihad, and what levels of taqlid is incumbent on them in Sharia. And which leads us to the a second question that I wanted to get into it. So if you defined taqlid and you defined ijtihad, what are the sources that you will explore in this discussion of what it means to follow an ijtihad or follow a taqlid? What are the sources into understanding that?
Yeah, so just before we get to the sources of that discuss ijtihad and taqlid, it is worth mentioning that only a few number of texts in Usul al-Fiqh actually bring the discussions of Ijtihad and Taqlid at the beginning of the book. Unfortunately, I haven't seen any of those books being taught at a university or college level within any Islamic seminary. They're just there sitting on libraries as a point of reference. And some Usul al-Fiqh texts, and especially Hanafi Usul al-Fiqh texts, forego and omit discussions on Ijtihad and Taqlid completely. Which is a shame, because a lot of Hanafi seminaries I see have neglected the study of this on a college or university level, and many students gain their entry point into this discussion is outside of the classroom, outside of the university, outside of college, in an argumentative, polemic, adversarial context, which isn't conducive to these discussions. So when we talk about the sources of Ijtihad and Taqlid, before we come to the Usul Fiqh text, Ijtihad and Taqlid, for the jurists, the sources for that are the Quran and the Sunnah. There are references to Ijtihad and Taqlid within the Quran and Sunnah, and also statements of the Sahaba and the conduct and actions of the Sahaba, in which how they engaged themselves either with the Quran and Sunnah or with the scholars that surrounded them. Later on, obviously you had the golden period of fiqh, when Islamic law was being developed between 100 Hijrah to 300 to 400 Hijrah, where a lot of Islamic law was being developed across the Muslim world. And towards the end of that period, we see the beginning of Usul Fiqh that attempted to codify the laws in the form of jurisprudential rulings. And it is in that context that the laws of Ijtihad and Taqlid started to be laid out within the texts. However, it should be noted that whereas Ijtihad and Taqlid were being discussed from 400 Hijrah, the first standalone text on either Ijtihad on Taqlid specifically only came around by a scholar within the 9th stroke 10th century. So that's 6 centuries after the starting of Usul al-Fiqh. Namely, the scholar's name was Samhudi, and his book is Al-Iqdul Farid, which hopefully we will be reading from within the upcoming course on Ijtihad and Taqlid starting from next week. So you had a 600-year gap in which Ijtihad and Taqlid was being discussed within the Usul texts. However, as a standalone book, it wasn't spun off as into a book until 600 or 500 years later. As for Ijtihad, then likewise, for a few hundred years, it was discussed within Usul Fiqh books, but not as a standalone or independent. There was no standalone independent book written on Ijtihad. It was only as a matter of complaint by some scholars that they wrote a book encouraging scholars to commit to Ijtihad. And we will be discussing within the course as to why scholars didn't really engage in Ijtihad as much as they did. And those reasons are not solely religious, but sometimes they're political, sometimes they're personal. And these are things which I'm keen to explore within the course. So overall, when we talk about the sources of Ijtihad and Taqlid, you have the Quran, you have the Sunnah, you have the Usul al-Fiqh texts, you have Fatawa, you have the fiqh books as well in them, in some places, in some key strategic issues which are discussed. Scholars do touch upon matters of Ijtihad and Taqlid. And then you have the standalone texts of Ijtihad and Taqlid that discuss the rulings of these two topics. In a contemporary setting where there has been great technological advancement, there has been a renewed focus on the rulings of Ijtihad and Taqlid and the parameters in which Muslim scholars and laymen alike should be engaging with these with this in their religious lives. So
why has there been this revival of discussing them?
Well,
I mean, people would say, "Oh, hasn't this been already discussed?" You know, from the, like you said, the earlier section of Islam. Why is there this discussion now being revived? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, if we look at the tone and nature of discussions that have taken place, much of it, or most of it, or some of it has been wholly inadequate and not appropriate for the context of many Muslims living in, for example, minorities or in the West. You have, let's take one simple example. You had Muslim India, run by the Mughal Empire, in which the majority of Muslims were Hanafi. Okay, right. You had colonialism come in, and obviously the entire fabric of the Islamic infrastructure was taken away from the Muslims then. As a result, Muslims had to develop new strategies to safeguard their faith. Fast forward, colonialism ended, and then there was migration from India to the West, principally UK, but also before that in South Africa, and also other areas in Africa, and also North America. Now, what happened was that Muslims were moving from a monolithic society in terms of madhhab. So you had a predominantly Hanafi society.
Right.
Now they're moving to a multi-madhhab society in the UK, where it's not only immigrants coming from the Indian subcontinent, but also you had Arab immigrants who are not necessarily Hanafi. You had Somali immigrants, right? You had converts coming into Islam who are exposed to the non-Hanafi school, and likewise in North America. So are the rulings that were applicable in a predominantly Hanafi society still applicable to a multi-madhhab society? That's
Right.
a fundamental question which hasn't really been answered on in a manner that is satisfactory for Muslims, or at least it's not conspicuous in the manner that needs to be. If we look at the context of the UK and the US, for example, it would be more like an ancient Egypt. By ancient Egypt, I mean in the classical era, where Egypt was a multi-madhhab society, and not like a Mughal Empire Hanafi monolithic society. So there is precedent in how Ijtihad and Taqlid operated in a multi-madhhab society. We Muslims living in multi-madhhab societies need to start looking at our rich Islamic tradition and history, and see where multi-madhhab societies flourished and how Ijtihad and Taqlid was exercised in those societies, as opposed to merely where we Muslims, or some Muslims, may have emigrated from.
Great. I mean, this also is. Leads us to the question of, why is it so important to study in the mind of an average Muslim out there? I mean, they keep mentioning this because of the fact that there's such a level of irrelevance sometimes found within Muslim communities. So they ask, why do we have to study these ancient theories on following scholars and whether to abide and by their opinions, and whether it's binding on myself, meaning ijtihad and taqlid? Why is it important and relevant in the modern world, where we have now access to at least all of the literature that they had, and ways to derive our own? So it goes from one extreme to another in that essence. And they want to know why it's important then to study this element of ijtihad and taqlid.
Okay, it's really important to study Ijtihad and Taqlid from the classical text, because this change was already happening within the classical era. It's not as if Ijtihad and Taqlid concepts remain stagnant within the classical era. Now, just because we Muslims have stagnated in our intellectual advancements, especially on a religious level, within the past 200 years or 300 years, due to various factors like colonialism and the astronomical rise of the non-Muslim West, we have a rich intellectual tradition to derive from, and we have lots of precedents within our own heritage that would give us indicators as to where the discussion on Ijtihad and Taqlid needs to head. So just to give you an example, in the beginning of Islam, it was very much an oral tradition. The only thing that was really being written immediately after the Prophet ﷺ passed away was the Quran. Only in a few places and by few people, hadith was being written. A few centuries later, there was an effort to write down a lot of knowledge in addition to the Quran. So the hadith, the fiqh, and the and other various Islamic disciplines. So there is a narration by Awza'i, the famous Syrian scholar of old, that he said that this knowledge was something that was between scholars, and it was considered a really valuable commodity. However, when knowledge started to enter the books, meaning when knowledge started to be written, people who weren't as qualified as the scholars started to engage with knowledge, because they had that access to knowledge because of the knowledge being written down. Yeah. Now, if we fast forward to our era, our context, the same thing is happening. The access to knowledge has been driven by social media, by mass printing, by mass communication. So just like scholars adapted back then to knowledge being transcribed within the books, scholars in this era also have to devise new methods of propagating knowledge, new methods for lay people and the common Muslim to engage in taqlid successfully without falling into the pitfalls, as you indicated earlier, of setting up a YouTube channel and disseminating knowledge, not knowing where your boundaries are. So I think this is a really important topic in our era and context, and this is something, inshallah, which we will be discussing in the course, as to what the limits are for taqlid, what the limits are for ijtihad, who can engage in either of them, and to what extent.
I mean, this also leads us to a further, like, I think, delineation of understanding what is Islamic authority then. I mean, a lot of the average Muslim out there, when they hear 4 opinions or 5 opinions, even more, of course, there's much more than that sometimes, they start to question. They're like, why is this there? The Quran is there, the Sunnah is there. So why do we have to follow you people anyway? We can just go and read, Sahih Bukhari or whatever. And then if the hadith is clear to me, what is the point of your Islamic authority? How do we respond to something like this?
Yes, and again, this argument isn't a new argument, and such people who engage in such arguments are probably unaware of Islamic history. The same argument was employed in ancient eras when the knowledge was started being transcribed within books. So back then there was a push by scholars to ensure that people who don't have sufficient knowledge, or do have some knowledge but they don't have proper training within the Islamic disciplines, and especially Islamic law, are not to engage in such a manner, and rather resort to Islamic authorities who have engaged with the tradition for an extended period of time. Because it is important to understand that before the advent of Islamic colleges and universities, where upon graduation you get a certificate. Before this, how did a student of knowledge become a scholar? It was by the acknowledgement of peers. So, for example, Imam Malik said that he didn't pass fatwa in Medina until 70 scholars or 70 of his teachers or his peers said or attested to the fact that he was able to do so. So that concept of peer acknowledgement remained within the tradition, and that manifested later on through obviously Islamic colleges and Islamic universities, where at the end of the course you would get an Alimiyya certificate. So the Alimiyya certificate basically is the college or the seminary or the university acknowledging that you are now capable or able to engage within the Islamic tradition like other scholars are. Obviously, there are various levels of that. There's now the relatively more new concept of masters and doctorate degrees, in which the certificate attests to one's ability to engage in independent research. But the concept is there that peer acknowledgement is really important. So if you have somebody from the from social media, or anybody who starts giving fatwa or starts speaking on on advanced Islamic concepts, it is incumbent, or it is everybody's right to ask where their credentials, or where their which peers of theirs or which Muslim scholars have acknowledged them to be qualified as such to be able to speak in this manner. And unfortunately, as you do identify, this is the era where there is mass communication. Anybody with a mic can come on social media and start speaking, and they will get many followers, especially if they're talking about something that is original or something that not many people are talking about. However, the process of having those credentials is really important.
Beautiful. I mean, one of the things I think also is important is that the average person who is in a secular education structure sometimes often applies the same constructs that were taught in that education structure on an Islamic education system. So, for example, the idea of an individual's opinion or the individual is something that is glorified in Western thought in particular. I mean, since I was young and you were young, you were told your opinion matters, your opinion matters. When then they come to an Islamic environment, especially when it's the classic ancient methodologies that have been passed on, and then being told, hold on a second, your opinion actually does not matter. You need to 100% follow these scholars and this madhab or this school and be completely binded to it. It kind of perplexes the average Muslim and the modern Muslim in this world, and they're saying, why should I do so? And it becomes more confusing when they find a disparaging level of methodologies. One group that says you have to follow the madhab to a T, another group that says, listen, you follow the generalities of Islam, and you have to have teachers. There's no one that calls to absolute chaos, which also is another methodology in the sense of you derive your own understanding, you derive your own interpretation, or these scholars know the interpretation that other scholars don't. So the average Muslim out there is confused in general. They don't understand the concept of Islamic authority by one group, which says, you know what, I can figure things out on my own. And then another extreme is, no, your entire confinement must be to this particular school. So navigating that is in and of itself is very daunting for the average person. Some people may even forget it. There's a famous story, I'm sure maybe you've heard of it as well. This is a true story. There's a Muslim that accepted Islam in Japan. And there was, in that particular masjid, I don't know if it's in Tokyo or where, but there was people from all over the world who practice different madhahib. There's Hanafis who, they're obviously engineers, mashallah, they end up even in Japan. And there's also the Japanese themselves. So there's Shafi'is and there's Hanafis, possibly Hanbalis or Malikis, because there's a school in Japan that follows, somewhat of a Hanbali curriculum. When that person accepted Islam, the first thing that people jump to is you have to follow the Hanafi madhab or you have to follow the Shafi madhab. So an argument started to the extent that the man said, what is going on? I came to accept a faith where people brought I thought perceived a level of unity in worshiping God. All I found is a faith that found themselves differing. So he left Islam on the spot. This teaches you to the level of complexity of this discussion. So what are your thoughts about this? I mean, what the average Muslim has to have a direction and being pulled towards. How do you kind of give them even a cursory advice navigating these extremes?
Yeah, obviously, for every action, there is a reaction, and the rigidity in following a particular school of law within Islam has led to the complete opposite, in which, especially in the context of societies in the West, which are founded upon individuality, that a lot of people we see today who haven't trained up within the tradition have gone directly to the Quran and Sunnah, stating that I have access to the Quran translation, I have access to the Hadith translation. Why do I need the tradition? So that is a valid question, and for every action there's a reaction, and this does not arise in a vacuum. This happens as a reaction to the opposite extreme, which is the rigidity and the inflexibility that has manifested quite frequently within the Muslim world and has transported itself to the West, in Europe and America, especially. So what I would say to that is the reality for the within the Islamic tradition is that pending traditional study within the Islamic circles, a scholar is free to engage in his or her personal independent reasoning as much as he or she wants. There's no harm in that. And any perceived restrictions to that are mainly unfounded. You'd find many scholars within the tradition of Islam in history, right up to today, who have studied under one particular school of law, but then through their independent research quite frequently disagree with their own school of law and adopt another opinion. And there's no harm in that at all. But the main stipulation is that they engage with the tradition itself, because the tradition is the most safest guarantee for them not adopting aberrant opinions in the future. As for Muslim laymen who are confused, or who might be confused with the multitude of opinions out there, and this is a particularly a problem in this era where you have access to information on the internet, you have various fatwa websites, you have access to various scholars on social media, you have YouTube channels, and everyone's giving their opinion, not only in Islamic law, but also in Islamic theology, Islamic philosophy, other aspects of Islam. Where does one go from there? So this is only a problem when non-scholars or laymen take those opinions and start becoming argumentative about them, or start to argue on behalf of the scholars from whom they've taken those opinions. The role of a muqallid, or the layman, is to trust any scholar in which they have faith in and to move on with their life. It is not incumbent upon them to defend the scholars they have taken their opinions from. Much of the mess which we see today is non-qualified people, non-mujtahids, or laymen, or the common Muslim, coming on social media and arguing stuff in which basically they have no business dabbling in. Because when you start arguing, that is an element, that is actually a sign of ijtihad. Ijtihad, or independent reasoning, is basically the domain of scholars, and scholars can argue with other scholars in their particular settings, and laymen may have access to that. They can listen to that, fine, but at the end of the day, the only thing they are religiously burdened with is to follow a scholar and move on with their own lives. This is something which we will be discussing in the course, as to the limits of or the parameters of Ijtihad and Taqlid, how far laymen can go with assessing or evaluating the scholar's opinion, when can they abandon the scholar they trust, in which context, etc., etc. And this is there are a few stipulations of Taqlid which we will be discussing, and likewise scholars, how do they instruct the laity within the Muslim Ummah in light of other opinions out there? How should a scholar interact with the Muslims in that regard?
Okay, so this leads us to understand. Okay, one of the things that I think the average person, which are on one extreme to the other, they don't understand that Islam has given us principles of how to practice the faith itself. Because it would not make sense. Allah sends us a book and doesn't tell us how to practice it. And I think the command that you referred to is from a direct Quranic injunction of the only thing obligated on a average person is to ask a qualified scholar. In essence, that is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ ذِكْرٍ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Ask the people of knowledge if you do not know, or ask the people of the reminder if you do not know. So that comes a direct obligation. In fact, this is the first obligation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes on a believer after they've accepted Islam, the 5 pillars of Islam and the 6 pillars of Iman. What's the first obligation? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that you came out of the wombs of your mothers. You don't know anything. So what's the first obligation? Ask the people of the reminder, meaning the scholars, if you do not know. And once you do that, exercising the judgment of the individual is also important, because the understanding of Islamic authority, you're going to discuss this in great detail, but it's in 3 levels. Understanding what is the normative ruling, which is al-hukm al-asli, what is the ruling of Islam, or what is the ruling of the Sharia with regards to this. And the madhabs differ, meaning based on their interpretation of the Quran, Sunnah, and the Islamic sources of law, whether it be the statement of a companion, or whether it be juristic understanding or analogy, qiyas, they derive whatever ruling it is. And that's the normative ruling, hukm al-asli, al-hukm al-shari. And then you have answers that are going to be based on different contexts and scenarios and situations, which is called fatwa. Now, fatwa, to many people, they think it's binding, they think it's lazim, but in reality, it's not. It's not lazim. they have full right, if they don't trust an answer, or if they realize that, you know, they asked a question about Islamic finances or something, and the person that they're asking doesn't seem to understand the situation, or not even that, your normative relationships, this person is not understanding fully, you can get from the question that you ask, you have full right to ask someone else. Because why? That person's fatwa does not speak on behalf of Allah and His Messenger in binding you to it. You can ask someone else who you feel is more qualified of your situation or your scenario. And then there's the third type, which is called Qada, judicial law. And judicial law in an Islamic system, or where there is an Islamic structure of muhakama or judicial process, that can be binding. Things like marriage, divorce, or inheritance law can be, and there's elements where it cannot be. So the average person doesn't know these things. And then when they don't know these things, they say, well, you know what, I'm going to figure things out on my own, not understanding that Islam has principles of both scholastic opinion and reasoning, and as well as a person to follow those scholars and reasonings, at the same time employing their own ijtihad, which leads us to ask, by the way, you have a follow-up to this? Anything?
Yeah, of course. And when we talk about Ijtihad and Taqlid, the three situations which you identified, one's personal life, then you have the ifta of the fatwa, and then you have the qada. Ijtihad and Taqlid differs in all three of them. And if you see Islamic history in practice, what might have been considered mandatory within qada, so for example, a judge has to stick to one madhhab,
right,
may not have necessarily translated itself into ifta or fatwa, let alone a personal practice. That's so true, when you see verdicts from scholars with regards to qada, that a particular qadi cannot exit the state's chosen madhhab, that doesn't necessarily translate into a person's personal practice in salah or hajj or zakah, for example, also being bound by that same particular madhab. These are two completely different theaters and arenas in which Ijtihad and Taqlid are discussed. So it is necessary, and we will discuss upon this, touch upon this within the course, that rulings that are applicable to personal practice are not necessarily applicable to ifta, and those rulings that are applicable to ifta in the context of adherence to or lack of adherence to a madhab are not necessarily applicable to qada. So these are different theaters which need separate discussions.
Excellent. This leads us to understanding, okay, what does it mean then to exercise ijtihad in the modern era? Okay, so we talked about ijtihad in classically in Islamic understanding, where it's derived from the authority that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given scholars and people to refer to them. So what does it mean then to have ijtihad or exercise ijtihad in the modern era? And what does Islamic law mean in reference to that?
Okay, just before we answer that question, when we talk about ijtihad basically means independent reasoning. For various reasons, not only in this era, but across Muslim history, many people, many scholars have been averse to using the word ijtihad for various reasons, because there is a perception in using the term ijtihad that one is becoming totally independent of the tradition, whereas that is not the case. Whereas many scholars in the past did engage in independent reasoning, not all of them labeled that as ijtihad. They either labeled it with other terms like tarjih or intisar or istinbat, and these are all terms which we will be discussing in the course. So when we talk about ijtihad, independent reasoning, there is a need for that in this era as well, especially in this era where there, as I mentioned earlier, there's been a lot of technological advancement. Muslims are engaged in the innovations produced mainly by the West. You have artificial intelligence. How should Muslims respond to that? You have space travel. How should Muslims respond to that? You have stem cell research. You have on a state level, you have new weaponry which wasn't existing before. How should Muslims respond to that from an Islamic legal perspective? E-commerce. How should Muslims respond to that? If you take traditional rulings on that, you would find that most of these transactions are null and void from the Islamic perspective. So there there needs to be
yes, yeah.
there needs to be a fresh re-looking at these issues and a new model for fiqh within these issues. Now, I'm not saying these issues haven't been discussed. They have been discussed. However, they haven't been woven into our Islamic pedagogy for fiqh and usul. There needs to be discussion within colleges and universities and advanced Islamic studies in general about these issues. So when students graduate from Islamic seminaries, they aren't befuddled as to the new things that are happening outside the four walls of the seminary.
Right.
In addition to the traditional learning, we also need students, seminaries also need to provide students with the tools to be able to look at these new things that are happening within the world. So students and graduates are prepared for the new world, and they are able to take a position on these things, because you're only able to take a position on these matters and able to engage in ijtihad in these matters only after you've studied them, right?
Right. I mean, that's a beautiful point. I mean, the unfortunate reality is that when a student even studies the fiqh basic matan, which it can be Quduri, it can be Umdat al-Fiqh or Akhsar al-Mukhtasarat or Zad, or it can be Risala, or it can be Matan Nabi Shuja', or these are the four basic texts, or some of the basic texts in the four madhahib. You will find that if you ask a very basic questions, for example, something along the lines of a woman in her menses, she cannot take a shower at work because her menses stopped. What should she do? That is not mentioned in the primary texts in any sense or way. So what happens is there becomes a separation between real world application and confining yourself only to the issues which are discussed in these books. So when we talk about sometimes modernizing the fiqh approach, think, oh, what do you mean? What has not been covered? Our scholars discussed everything under the sun. What we mean by that is modernizing our articulation of it, not the fact that the principles need to be completely destroyed. You bring up new principles, but rather where is its application in modernity? So this is a beautiful point that you've made, because the average student of knowledge, when they're unfortunately indoctrinized by a particular belief or movement, whether it be you have to follow madhab to the T like a Xerox machine, the entire goal of the student then becomes becoming so harfi, literal in the madhab, that they lose complete sight of the application in real world, in the real world. As for the one who completely derides Islamic studies in the first place, they don't understand the idea of principles and contextual application. So they don't understand the fact. I mean, so many people that I've spoken to who come from particular background in maybe Western academic studies, to them principles and contextualizing application or interpretation or hermeneutics does not exist. Meaning, why? The average person can then figure out for themselves, as long as they make a valid argument or rationalize it to themselves. And I think between that and the other is where we need to head. And you mentioned this idea of moving forward in ijtihad and applying it in a context where the average person in the modern world will be able to understand personal worship, their ibadat, as well as the new issues in ibadat. For example, do we have to wash every single time something with water and seven washings and once with dirt? Does this have to be done, or does it not have to be done? Or is there be able to understand, for example, can a washing machine take place of something like that? And this is the first chapter of Tahara. Otherwise, people misunderstand these kind of concepts in light of the real world. One of the things that I think it leads us to then asking is then, what is the actual connection between madhabs and ijtihad and taqlid? Should there be a connection in the minds of people? And is the link between them real or imaginary legal obligation? Or in other words, are scholars gatekeeping the laity? So go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Just before I answer that, on the topic of updating our knowledge of fiqh and disseminating that within the masses, and you give an example there about women in the workplace. Now, obviously, the ideal within the classical Islamic text is that women stay at home and take care of the house. However, it is a reality within the West and in our context, not only in the West, but across the world now, that women are in the workplaces. So the basic fact here is that if we're going to stick to a particular ruling within your particular madhab, or the madhab that is predominant within your society, and that ruling doesn't allow for any flexibility, there should be room for Muslims to take from the other madhab, and that is where cross-madhhab studies is important for these types of issues. Because if that is not done, then the alternative is to make Muslims feel guilty, to make Muslims feel as if they've sinned, that they've abandoned this particular ruling, not knowing that there are alternative positions within other classical madhahib. So this model of making Muslims feel as if they're fusaq or they're sinners or transgressors en masse is a model I completely disagree with, and this needs to be rectified. And this is something which we will be discussing in the course. And you will find precedent within Islamic history that a particular scholar has observed a situation where I'll give you the exact example. The issue of Fajr within Central Asia, predominantly Hanafi region. A lot of Muslims back then were reading Fajr in a manner that they started Fajr within time, but sunrise started during their prayer. Now, according to the classical Hanafi opinion, that Fajr would be invalidated because of sunrise. However, that scholar observed that a lot of Muslims in that area were reading Fajr so late that this happened, that their Fajr entered within sunrise. So he said that let's take from the other madhab and let's not tell the Muslims to repeat their Fajr and tell them that they're sinners, that they've missed Fajr. Rather, let's just take the opinion from the other madhab and the other opinion and say your Fajr is still valid nonetheless. So I think this is an important thing, and it's not something that's completely new. There is solid precedent for that, to take from other madhabs, so not to let Muslims feel en masse that they have sinned. So coming to your question now, sorry, I forgot what the question was.
The question was the following. So what is the actual connection between madhhabs and Ijtihad and Taqlid?
Yeah. So
a connection, or is it something that is imaginary legal fiction where scholars are gatekeeping and using this terminology in order to stop from the average Muslim from developing their own law?
Yeah. Okay. So the basic fact is madhabs do not have a legal personality. Let me explain what that means.
Okay.
Madhabs are a product of ijtihad. Scholars come together from a particular area. Let's talk about the 2nd century and the 3rd century of Hijrah. Scholars came together. They discussed and debated these things amongst themselves, and they came upon one ruling, or in the context of multiple scholars discussing this and disagreeing, they came upon multiple rulings. All those rulings form part of that madhab. So when we talk about madhabs, they are a product of ijtihad, right? Because they're a product of ijtihad, and you might have multiple mujtahids, that madhab might have multiple positions within it. A madhab can contain multiple positions. So if a madhab can contain multiple positions, who is then to decide which is the most authoritative position?
Right.
A scholar is coming afterwards, right?
Right.
So a scholar is coming afterwards. If they are positioning themselves or situating themselves in a manner that determines which is the most authoritative position, then they, in essence, have become a judge over the earlier mujtahids of the school. So you have scholars who've come centuries later, not in all madhabs, but let's take the Hanafi madhab for example. You have a famous scholar by the name of Ibn Abidin, who was a 13th century Syrian scholar of the Hanafi school. He is considered by many Hanafis as the final word on what is the most authoritative position within the Hanafi school.
Right.
There have been many scholars who've come in between him and the founders of the Madhhab, Imam Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf and Muhammad.
Right.
What made him the judge over every opinion that has passed within the Madhhab over the past 1,000 years?
Right.
He was a great scholar, no doubt, but the process in which he became the judge is not as well defined as it should be.
Right.
Is it a matter of perception that madhabs and ijtihad and taqlid are intellect, or is it a reality? I would contend that it is a matter of perception only. So let me give another example. When does a madhab become a madhab?
Right.
So you have Abu Yusuf and Muhammad, who are the main two students of Imam Abu Hanifa.
Mm-hmm.
They have independent positions that differ with Imam Abu Hanifa. Do we consider Abu Yusuf and Muhammad madhabs within their own right, or do we still consider them two and other students of Imam Hanifa as part of within the Hanafi rubric or within the Hanafi fabric? They're mainly considered within the Hanafi school. Now, Imam Muhammad, who was a student of Abu Hanifa, he was also a student of Imam Malik.
Right. For longer.
He's not considered a Maliki.
Right. He studied for 3 years and studied with Abu Hanifa 2 years.
Sorry?
He studied with Imam Malik for 3 years and with Imam Abu Hanifa too.
Yeah. He studied. He joined Imam Abu Hanifa quite late on, and he was still a teen basically at the time he joined Abu Hanifa in 148. He was a teenager when or in his early 20s. So Imam Malik has his own madhab. His student was Imam al-Shafi'i.
Right.
So why isn't Imam al-Shafi'i to Imam Malik treated the same as Abu Yusuf is to Abu Hanifa? Why is Shafi'i considered to be a separate madhab from Malik?
Right.
Again, it's a matter of perception. Let's move on. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, he's a student of Imam al-Shafi'i. Not only is he a student of Imam al-Shafi'i, he's also a student of Imam Abu Yusuf from his early days. Imam Ahmad's early days, he was a student of Imam Abu Yusuf. He's not considered a Hanafi. He's not considered a Shafi'i. Rather, he's considered his madhab is considered a standalone madhab. So the development of madhahib is largely a matter of perception, is largely a matter of dare I say political factors, and this is something. This is something.
School as formalization, tadween.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a matter which we will be discussing in next Sunday. That the codification of the madhahib and the spread of the madhahib, obviously everything happens by the will of Allah, but the reasons given, you'll see, are mainly political considerations and political factors. And this is something that needs to be known, because there came a time within Islamic history, and that perception lingers on to this day, that the madhahib are somehow munazzal min Allah, or they have the state of something that is revelation.
There's a sanctity to them that you must.
There's a sanctity attached to these madhahib.
Right.
Whereas in fact, they could be revered and respected all the time, and at the same time, a scholar within the madhahib can differ with them in any of the issues that
they're not untouchable in that sense.
And that it is that sanctity and that over reverence that has held back many scholars from engaging with the tradition, with ijtihad, that they would have otherwise done, because we will be discussing in this course. Sorry, I'm repeating this, but it is something I've left for the course. That many scholars were mujtahids or did have the ability to do ijtihad, but they didn't do so because of, quite frankly, their livelihoods. They were worried about their livelihoods, and as I mentioned earlier, the state system of qada of the judiciary was linked very heavily to a particular madhab, and so they didn't want to differ with that with the state law for the fear of losing their jobs. Because at the end of the day, we hear stories about Imam Ahmad standing up to the then Mu'tazili Khalifa. Not everybody was Imam Ahmad. Not everybody was able to put their life or their livelihood on the line. And there are many stories of that within Islamic history, of Muslim scholars within their biographies, that they weren't able to. They feared falling out of favor with the rulers or their benefactors or those people who provided with the food on the table, basically. So these are important aspects that we need to consider when we talk about scholars or the rulings they gave. The scholars didn't live in a vacuum. They all had their own problems. They all had their own context. They all had their own social context, political context that they were living in, and this is something which is important when we talk about Ijtihad and Taqlid.
Right. Well, one thing that's actually super shocking that was to me personally, when I started to read more into it, as you develop your understanding of a particular madhab, and as you develop and you start finding that there is also inter-madhab, you could say, fanaticism towards the view of particular scholars, which they call the mu'tamad, or the chosen view of the school. So the chosen view of the school, as you said, will simply be the later scholars because they knew the most or the best as the earlier ones. And like you said, it's a judgment of a person without them being present, and that's not allowed in Qada, by the way, in any case. But so it's a judgment of the earlier scholars, like for example, the Hanbali insisting on the later scholars being the chosen view versus Ibn Qudama rahimahullah or others, for example, even before that. So this concept of fanaticism actually. You find that sometimes it's unfounded, and sometimes this insistence has simply no evidence for it to begin with. There's nothing stating that you must confine to this, other than the fact that the traditional excuse that is often quoted can lead to your desires or following your desires because you're arbitrarily picking. I'd like you to focus on this, but I'd like to also continue that portion with another question, is that you will see the students of knowledge limiting themselves, even though when you find your study has developed and you look at the later scholars who have prolific works, they themselves did not confine to the madhab itself when it came to comparative fiqh studies, such as Ibn Qudama, such as Imam al-Nawawi of the Shafi'iyya, such as al-Qarafi of the Malikis, and many of the Hanafis themselves. And interestingly enough, when you look at some of the greatest scholars of every madhab, you find that they did not follow this exclusivist, fanatical understanding of what it means to stick to a madhab. People like al-Tahawi, the Hanafi, people like Muhammad ibn al-Hasan in al-Asl, and others, as the examples I gave earlier. Can you then describe, number one, the first point, the question that we lost, is how do you then respond to people who say, you're calling in essence to following your desires, which can be translated as tatabbu al-rukhas, or following the easy views of scholars, or fatwa shopping if you want to make it even more simple. And answer this question and I'll follow up so you don't forget the second question. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So when this term is thrown around about following desires, that concept is relative. Right. The stricter you are going to be on taqlid, any other position will be following desire according to your definition of
according to your view.
Yeah. So if you're going to say you have to follow the mu'tamad or the relied upon or the most authoritative or so-called authoritative opinion within one madhab, then by definition, if someone follows another opinion from that madhab, but it's not the so-called mu'tamad, then he would be considered following desire, which is absurd. Now, someone might say, oh, he or she can follow any opinion from within the madhab, but they just can't take from another madhab. Right. So then by that definition, a person who is a Hanafi, for example, takes from the Maliki school would be following desire. So it's all relative, it's all subjective. And again, when we talk about madhabs are mostly perception anyway. So what do we mean by madhab? So that's another issue that needs to be solved. So when we talk about fanaticism, when it comes to adherence to the so-called preferred or the authoritative position of the school, this was never the case within the early scholars of the madhahib. It was never the case, and there was always this understanding that scholars can differ, not only with the scholars around them, but also with the founders of the madhahib. It was never the case. I mean, this accusation was never flung within the earlier centuries of Islam. It is only when flawed perceptions of Ijtihad and Taqlid developed that such concepts arose. Another point which I want to go back to is the issue of mu'tamad. the authoritative positions, and something which I mentioned earlier. There is a role for that. It's not something I'm completely denying, but it is mentioned mostly by the scholars in the context of Qada and Ifta. So Qada, where a state needed some certainty, some commercial or some judicial or social or political certainty, the state was saying that, or these are the sets of rules which we're going to adhere by, right? So it wasn't a case of following desire then, it was just a case of political certainty for commercial certainty in the case of commercial disputes. I mean, just to give you a crude analogy, when we talk about Brexit, for example, and that the UK needs to get a deal with the European Union, why are businesses crying right now within the UK? Because they want certainty. They want to know which set of laws they're going to be governed by at the end of the whole process of Brexit. So it's the same case within any society, not only Muslim societies, but any society. They want to know which laws they're going to be governed by. They want to know which set of laws they have to adhere to, so they can set up their businesses that way. So I mean, so there is a role for a certain set of laws, but that is only in the context of Qada. And also, if there, or you had state muftis or state appointed muftis, so they had a quasi judicial role. So in that context, it is also understandable that muftis of the state would have to adhere to a particular set of rulings, even though they might prefer within their own personal lives another ruling, but for the purposes of the state, they would have to adhere to a particular text or particular legal ruling that would be binding. To transfer that to personal practice, that a scholar in his or her personal practice has to adhere to the mu'tamad within the school, that is a completely flawed concept. And some scholars have done that in the past, but they have been called out upon. And this is something which we will be discussing upon in the course. So
so what is the course? Tell us about the course. What's happening with the course?
Yeah. So in the course, we're going to be heavily relying upon classical, doing readings from classical texts and applying them to the modern context. Because it is important for us in the course that we tie or bind the classical theory with the modern context. It's not going to be a dry course. It is a course that I can guarantee which will be life-changing for those who have had previous notions of rigidity or had previous notions of Islamic law being very restrictive in practice. And we will be proving all these through precedent. It's not something we're coming out with new completely. However, when a narrative of adherence or rigidity becomes dominant, then it becomes incumbent upon us to rediscover the alternative narratives which are there within our tradition. And we will be doing readings from various classical Islamic texts. We will be doing readings from modern Islamic texts. We will be doing readings from various fatwa. We shall also be doing discussions on Ijtihad and discussing that, obviously, how Ijtihad manifested itself within the classical era, within the medieval era, and how it can manifest itself within the modern era. And we shall also be discussing Taqlid and how Taqlid has changed from era to era and how it should manifest itself today, obviously with the advancement within access to information, and how muqallids or the Muslim laity should be navigating themselves through the myriad of different opinions, not only within Islamic law but also other Islamic disciplines, and how to navigate through that confusion. We shall be discussing within the course other aspects that are associated with Ijtihad and Taqlid. So, for example, the issue of adherence to a madhhab or an Islamic school of law. Is it necessary? In which context would it be necessary? Who have opposed it? The number of scholars who have opposed it. Which geographies, this is important, which geographies within Islamic history were leaning towards the non-obligation of adherence to a school of law versus which geographies did lean to that, and what were the factors that determined that. So, for example, you have scholars within a particular region like Central Asia. They had different rulings from scholars within Egypt, for example. They had different rulings from scholars within the Maghrib and Andalus and the Hijaz. So we shall be discussing all of that and the factors that informed the scholars' positions behind those. We shall be following the concept of following desires, as you identified earlier. When does it become an issue of following desire, and is that prohibited or not? The issue of talfiq, for those who know that already, mixing between various positions. And overall, it is going to be a very interesting course, inshallah, because these are things which impact directly upon scholars, students of knowledge, and the common Muslim in their day-to-day practice, because obviously, as we identified earlier, Taqlid and Ijtihad has three different or distinct arenas. You have the judicial aspect, you have the ifta, quasi-judicial aspect, and you have the personal practice aspect, and how Ijtihad and Taqlid rulings can differ within each. So we shall also be discussing how Ijtihad and Taqlid tie in with the concept of maqasid, or the objectives of Sharia, and also the concept of maslaha, or the greater good, and the issue of valid versus invalid opinions, and how to identify invalid opinions. And I mean, there's so much to cover within this course, and I mean, that is why we've set it up as 20 lectures across 10 weeks. So inshallah, it'll be beneficial not only for the participants, but also for me as well, because it's going to require of me to do a lot of reading. And I've done a lot of reading already, but again, it's going to require of me to revise what I've read over the past 6 or 7 years. So inshallah, yeah.
Jazakumullah khair. I think that's a great overview. I think for people who are interested in seeing the outline of the class, because I don't know if you've written or heard everything that Sheikh Ismail mentioned, just go ahead and go to legacy.institute/academy, and you will find the course Ijtihad and Taqlid. You will find a detailed outline. You'll find and maybe even I can show it to you actually, if we can pull it up right now. We will show it to you so you can see it. And make it simpler for you to just navigate. Give us a second here. And inshallah, we'll then after that take a Q&A of some of the questions that were asked. And maybe some of them are very detailed. So we may not be able to cover them in such detail, except that will be spoken about in the course. But inshallah, we will try to cover as much as we can. Just give me one moment, please. Okay, so we go here, and you just go to Academy. And while it loads, you just scroll down to the course by Sheikh Ismail. We have right here Advanced Usul Study. And then you will find, inshallah ta'ala, a detail of an outline as well as the resources used. And importantly, the early bird for this ends tomorrow. That's something important for everybody to just consider before the price goes up. But here we have, again, detailed requisites. A lot of people ask this question, what do you need? You have to be fluent in Arabic. It's mandatory because you'll be looking at a number of these texts. But because of so many people that have been maybe shown interest, we will look at and we will put out a poll. If you're interested in this and you don't speak Arabic, we might do a smaller course. Perhaps I'll ask Sheikh Ismail, which will speak about these issues to a non-Arabic speaking audience, or at least that are not proficient in Arabic, to make it simpler, and maybe a smaller course that will go over it in much detail, since it is something that is pretty much every person in every Muslim in the world is something that we'll deal with. He also says fluency in Urdu is desirable, because he'll be accessing some resources written by the scholars who speak Urdu. We have, again, here's the course objectives in great detail. I'm not going to go over them because there's so many. and outlining exactly what the course is and the references, inshallah. With that, I want to now head to discussing the Q&A section. We will now start taking some questions, inshallah, that we had already. If we don't get to all of them, please forgive us, inshallah. A number of the questions that are asked by Adib will actually be discussed in the course. So Adib Shams asks, for example, the question here, what are limitations of valid and justified ijtihad? That's going to be discussed in the course. The limitations of valid ijtihad versus following opinions that may be aberrant or invalid. Maybe you can touch on that.
Okay, absolutely. As you mentioned, this will be discussed in detail in the course, but suffice to say that scholars have grappled with this for centuries, and you won't find an answer. That's the simple truth to that. But I did find, thanks to a reference put out by Sheikh Salman, who is delivering other courses with Legacy, that At-Tufi, the famous Hanbali scholar, he said that there are matters of agreement between scholars, and there are matters of valid disagreement between scholars, and there's a gray area in between wherein scholars cannot agree whether the matter of difference of opinion is a valid one or an invalid one. So, for example, just to give you a quick example, the issue of music.
Yeah, I was just going to say that.
It's a straightforward example. As an art form, right? Music as an art form, not with the obvious fawahish or immoral activities.
Everything that's immoral, obviously, is haram.
Yeah, music as an art form.
Right.
The common perception is that it is not allowed, and those scholars who have adopted this opinion, they are completely wrong. So it's an invalid opinion.
Right.
However, there is a growing.
They quote ijma'at, like they say 22 scholars have quoted ijma' on this, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Again, what constitutes ijma, and how can an ijma be incorrectly quoted? That's another issue which I'm happy to discuss later on. But there is a growing minority of scholars who have stated that yes, they disagree with music being halal, but they consider the difference of opinion to be a valid one.
Right.
So this is an example of a gray area of valid versus invalid opinion, and the reference is within At-Tufi's book Halal al-Uqad, in the introduction of that book. I was really happy to find that reference to reinforce my previous position that scholars can disagree over what constitutes
valid and invalid.
A valid or an invalid opinion.
But we can say that the vast majority, you can say, of normative opinions within the corpus of Islamic jurisprudence, valid and invalid is kind of understood. But there are choice issues which you can say, okay, there's a gray area. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, music is not the only example. You can, so for example, the issue of marrying without a wali, the Hanafi position. Many scholars outside the Hanafi school said this is a completely invalid position.
Right, of course.
So much so that a judge within a Maliki state would not consider their marriage valid, and they would separate between the couple. However, the majority of scholars outside the Hanafi schools have stated that, although they severely disagree with that position, but if such a couple were to venture into a Maliki or Shafi or Hanbali state, they would be allowed to remain together. So that's just another example. And I mean, there's so many examples.
Right. Inshallah, another session post after the class and have some details, inshallah. Anas asks, what's your opinion on laymen doing unrestricted talfiq between the four madhhab? Unrestricted talfiq between the four madhhab.
Yeah, you'll have to wait for the course.
Right.
If I gave all the answers now, they wouldn't be
are obviously going to require a great amount of
detail. Just to give you a preamble, the confusion within talfiq stems from the definition of talfiq. I mean, talfiq can be defined in 7 or 8 different manners. So depending on how you define talfiq, that is going to be the hukm or the ruling on talfiq. So, for example, if talfiq merely means the ability to take from different schools, so a Muslim takes from the Hanafi school in zakah and the Maliki school in, for example, nikah and talaq.
Right.
According to some scholars, that is the definition of talfiq.
Right.
So, and according to that, those scholars who say that it's not necessary to adhere to one school of law, they would say it's fine. They're completely unrelated issues, and this type of talfiq is valid, taken from the Hanafi school in the issue of zakah and salah, or in acts of worship, and taken from the Maliki school within family law, nikah and talaq. That is completely fine. If you define talfiq as, for example, in one issue, so a person does wudu according to the Hanafi school, then reads salah according to the Maliki school, is that allowed? So these are more interconnected issues. So you would find that there's a difference of opinion on that. So these are issues which we will be discussing in detail in the course in week 9, I believe.
Inshallah, inshallah. FIFA Freebies says, what is the correct understanding of the layman has no madhab?
So the layman has no madhab. Again, it's a matter of dispute in terms of how is that sentence to be defined. It is a sentence that is found within the books of Usul texts. A layman has no madhab, i.e. a madhab, because what does a madhab mean? A madhab means something you arrive at via independent reasoning. So that would typically be scholars or students of knowledge who have studied to an advanced level in a manner that they are able to understand the evidences of a particular issue. So if you're unable to do that, then you don't have a madhab. So that is one definition of that maxim. Another definition of that maxim is that because a layman has no madhab, they are able to take from any scholar they want. So they add the clause that al-ammiyu la madhhab lahu, a layman has no madhab, wa madhhabuhu madhhabu mufti. His madhab would be the madhab of the person giving him fatwa. So if he takes from scholar A on Monday, then that is his madhab, and then scholar B on Tuesday, then that would be his madhab. So majority of usulis agreed with this maxim that a layman has no madhab. There is one scholar of note, Ibn Hajar al-Makki. He said a layman does have a madhab. However, even he vehemently allowed, in spite of this, for the layman to take from other madhahib. So he said that a layman has a madhab, but in spite of that, he's allowed to do intiqal or switch madhahib, so take from other madhahib in individual issues. So for him, it's a redundant concept. So if you have a madhab, but you're still allowed to take from other madhab, then what does it mean for a layman to have a madhab? It doesn't really mean anything. It's a redundant concept. So it's not really one of the major talking points within the course.
Right. I mean, this also stems from the idea that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not define the general commandment in the Quran, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Ask the people of the reminder. He didn't say ask the people of the reminder of the Hanafis, or ask the people of the reminder within a particular context.
So it goes back to the issue of usul, in which am and mutlaq, can they be qualified retrospectively? So obviously it came down as a general verse, so nothing can restrict the meaning of that. The only thing that can potentially restrict it is, as we mentioned earlier, at state level, out of preventative measures, is Saddul Dari'ah. So to again, not to qualify the verse in and of itself, but rather for external reasons, which I mentioned earlier on, like political certainty, commercial certainty, etc., etc. So
Naveed asks, when you are referring to the need for ijtihad in this day and age, do you mean according to the usul of the established and agreed upon madhahib, or do you mean according to some new usul? You touched upon this, but I think he wants more.
Yeah, so again, just like fiqh, usul al-fiqh can also be subject to quite a bit of refinement and reform. When we talk about ijtihad, the fundamentals of ijtihad are the same across the madhhab. So knowledge of a certain number of verses of the Quran, particularly the law verses of the Quran, knowledge of the particular hadith that pertain to fiqh, knowledge of ijma, consensus of the scholars, and knowledge of analogy. So these are the bare bones of ijtihad. So they don't really differ from era to era. They're basically the same. The application of these can differ. Your understanding of issues can differ. So, for example, what constitutes a sales contract? Is e-commerce a sales contract? You might looking at ancient texts, and e-commerce would basically would have been a null and void contract. But everybody engages in e-commerce nowadays. They buy things from eBay or Amazon or other e-commerce websites. So refining the sales contract to be for us to be able to live our lives in our context or in our age is a matter of ijtihad. So how would you arrive at that ijtihad? You would use the tools of ijtihad, obviously the Quran and the Sunnah, or the Ijma and the Qiyas, and but at the same time you would also use secondary tools such as urf and maslaha and other forms of precedent, which are in the form of Muslim scholars, how they reacted to chains of different forms of commercial and sales contracts. So I mean, there's a lot of flexibility when it comes to ijtihad, so long as it is faithful to the tradition.
Okay, good. So basically, the usul are derived from obviously principles in the tradition. Is that something that is completely bereft of it?
Yes.
Okay, great. Two more questions, inshallah, and we'll close, because some of the questions have started now becoming fatwa and fiqh questions. We're not going to answer fiqh and fatwa questions. It's about ijtihad and defined course, inshallah, or defined parameters. Talib asks, in Islamic finance, they take from all madhahib to create contracts or rulings, meaning today, in our time. But if the madhahib differ in usul, how can then different rulings be utilized? Won't this create inconsistencies?
So your question is basically is talfiq allowed or not? So if you allow talfiq, then obviously the model of Islamic finance is allowed. When it comes to the issue of inconsistencies, is Islamic finance inconsistent? Just as an example, but it's not only Islamic finance. There's various issues pertaining to medicine, so stem cell research, clinical death. How do we understand this in the light of madhahib? Are we just going to, for example, stick to the Maliki madhab, to see what they say about clinical death?
Right.
I mean, there's so many issues which I'm sure you can dig out. But what scholars need to do, or what scholars have done already, is that they nowadays, especially, they're not restricting themselves to one madhab. What they're trying to do is that they are trying to create a model that allows Muslims to live their lives in the most harmonious way possible, without putting them in difficulty, or without imposing upon them such verdicts that would be too restrictive or harsh for them, that they would feel as if they've sinned if they violated them. So we are seeing a trend within Muslim scholars generally, especially when it comes to new issues, but also issues such as Hajj, because
Right.
I mean, obviously with the pandemic it's slightly different, but in years gone by, Hajj has become an enterprise which is completely different than how it was even
Right.
50 or 100 years ago. So there is an emerging model within Kitab al-Hajj that states that we are going to take the easiest position from each school, and your Hajj would be valid. Why? Because without that, you have tens of thousands of Muslims from one madhab, from the Hanafi madhab, for example, or from the Maliki madhab, who would land into great difficulty due to the huge sizes of pilgrims coming to Mecca. So, I mean, this model, it is a novel model, but it is something that Muslim scholars need to seriously consider. So overall, whether it's all issues like Hajj, non-Nawazil, or Zakat, or new issues like the ones I just mentioned, like Islam, like you mentioned, the question you mentioned, Islamic finance, there isn't really a problem for Muslim scholars to engage with the tradition in a manner that sees the most practically or the most pragmatic opinions, bring them together and to create a model that would allow Muslims to practice upon. I'm not saying Islamic finance doesn't have flaws at all. I mean, it does have flaws, but it is a model that Muslims can adhere to. I mean, some scholars believe that it is not a model worth looking into, and those same scholars allow, for example, conventional finance. It's not an issue, it's a discussion I want to go into, but I mean, you'd find an array or a spectrum of opinions within this that allows or disallows various instruments within Islamic
In
finance.
essence, the differences of opinion that exist are just a product of the organic aspect or component of the Sharia itself. The Sharia is not static, and that actually, by the way, is an evidence against those who tell you to completely restrict yourself to a madhab tooth and nail regarding regardless of what happens in the world and its application. The Sharia itself is organic, and people try to make it completely static in that essence. Now, we've already discussed that having a framework is fine, but also relegating yourself to 2 or 3 scholars which you have access to in order for you to navigate some of these issues is what the average person is simply obligated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Have a scholarship. If you have an opinion, then you move forward, and that's utilitarian as in essence in itself. But the differences itself will exist because obviously the scholars will differ on the application of the usul they study, and I think you're going to be at least discussing that in some level of depth. The last question, inshallah. Muhammad asks, in this course you will be discussing in this course will you be discussing what constitutes binding ijma, and whether there can be non-binding ijma or time-bound ijma?
I wish I was, but it's not something that's listed within the course outline. But I'm happy to briefly touch upon it now. That ijma, basically, there's 2 ways to identify ijma, which is consensus or the agreement of Muslim scholars. And when that happens, then that in itself becomes a proof or that all later scholars have to adhere to. So there's 2 ways of identifying ijma. One is by riwayah. So you are narrating from a scholar who has identified an ijma, or you are narrating from a scholar who's narrated from a scholar who's narrated from a scholar who has identified ijma. That's one way. And the other way is by you yourself as a scholar picking out every scholar alive or around you, or a scholar within a particular era, and gathering all their statements. So the more scholars you gather, the stronger your claim to ijma becomes. Is a natural or a rational thing to do. So, the more scholars you have agreeing listed or documented agreeing to a particular position, the stronger the claim to ijma would be. Now, obviously, ijma is not always qat'i, it's not always definitive. You can have ijma which is dhanni, which is non-definitive, which means a rival scholar can state that I don't agree with this ijma. I don't believe there's ijma in this issue. So there's ijma' qat'i, obviously, and then there's ijma' dhanni. Just like a hadith, you have a hadith which is qat'i, definitely from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or hadith dhanni, in which there's speculation, in which the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said it, or the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam did say, but was that the final hadith on the issue? Was it not abrogated? Was it abrogated or not abrogated later on? So, so that would be a type of non-binding ijma. So when a scholar claims ijma, it's not necessarily binding, unless it is made clear that this ijma is a ijma qat'i. A time-bound ijma would be when an issue is bound by a particular reason, and when that reason is no longer applicable, then the ijma ceases to exist. So the hukm or the ruling is not mandatory during that era because of the ijma, but because of the particular context that was applicable in that era. And when in later eras, when it's no longer applicable, then that ruling would no longer be applicable. So that is a time-bound ijma. It's not technically an ijma if something is time-bound. In Arabic, you would say al-hukm al-mu'allalu bi'illati, a ruling that is bound because of the reason attached to it. So when the إذا زالت العلة زال الحكم, when the reason is no longer there, then the ruling obviously is no longer there. Another ruling might come into play.
Great, Jazakumullah khair. Last question here we have from Nayab, which is, have the ulama identified different classes among lay people? Some lay people have more Islamic or fiqhi knowledge than others. Does taqlid work differently when lay people have more or less knowledge?
That is an excellent question. In traditional usul texts, there isn't much differentiation between laymen. They're all lumped into one block. Right. However, there is a need to acknowledge, especially within this era, that there are various levels of laymen. Some laymen know Arabic. I mean, obviously the Arab population, Arab common Muslim knows Arabic, but non-Arabs, they also know Arabic, and they've studied Arabic in the context of Islamic studies. So they would have more knowledge of more Islam than other common Muslims. So would rulings for them differ to other common Muslims? I'm sure there is room for discussion within this particular aspect of taqlid, and this is something I am willing to explore within the course. Obviously, I haven't fully developed my views on this, but there is scope for discussion within this regard. So hold this space, watch this space.
Inshallah. I think one of the interesting aspects is this, because there are now a number of, you could say, more average people which are scholastically, or increasingly becoming scholastically literate within the tradition. So their understanding of some of the minutiae of Sharia, as well as the istidlal, or the reasonings of evidences from the scholars, is much more developed than the average person. So their decisions or judgment is going to differ from a person who absolutely knows nothing, or doesn't understand what illah means and hukm means, or qiyas, or usul al-fiqh in general, as opposed to a person who really needs to just go to a scholar and just get an answer so that they can move on along. Whereas another person who can say, all right, in general, I understand what's going on. I'm not able to derive a ruling, but I understand the conceptualizations of the scholars in adjusting those rulings. Are those people the same in your eyes? Yeah, Sheikh Ismail.
They're similar in many aspects, but I mean, again, there's room for discussion for them to be different in some other aspects. So, for example, a layman who has studied Arabic and has studied a prime text from any madhhab, and is aware of the evidences, can that layman not adopt a position in, for example, in which they feel passionately and strongly about, for example, the issue of if they're a biologist and they're in stem cell research, can they not adopt a position on that, and also simultaneously inform scholars of what they feel about the issue.
Right.
Another issue is, for example, someone who's a stockbroker and they have some rudimentary knowledge of Islamic law. They are more aware of the issues surrounding the stock market and shares and general finance issues.
Right.
I mean, they would be more familiar with these issues than scholars themselves. I mean, scholars would refer to these Muslims to be able to formulate rulings. So they would be part of the discussion on creating the rulings on new financial instruments, for example. So, I mean, technically, from an Islamic perspective, they are still laymen, but they need to be involved, especially if they're professionals with a particular specialty within a particular field. They wouldn't be classified. They shouldn't be classified, I believe, on the same level as, for example, a Muslim working in a farm, or I mean, not that the demeaning them, but we need a new ijtihad, and we need the resources of all Muslims worldwide to be able to inform us on new issues that are arising on a daily basis nowadays, for scholars to be able to exercise ijtihad. So these Muslims, common Muslims, need to be part of those discussions.
Jazakumullah khair. Inshallah, again, I'm going to have the flyer up for those of you who are interested in finding out about the class. The class is from October 10th to December 13th, inshallah. It'll be every Saturday and Sunday, 9:45 p.m. Mecca time, which is 7:45 p.m. in the UK, or 2:45 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, meaning the US, New York City, and Canada, and so on and so forth. You can find out information at legacy.institute/academy. And again, the last time that the early bird will end tomorrow, which is October 5th, inshallah azza again, Sheikh Ibrahim, Ismail Ibrahim, Sheikh Ismail, for joining us. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you. And inshallah, this course is fruitful. And we look forward, inshallah, to maybe having some more discussions on this topic, maybe some details. And also, maybe, I hope, inshallah, that he takes up a class that will be for English speakers as well, maybe a smaller course rather than a full-fledged 18 session or 20 session course, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair for your time. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you. وصحبه أجمعين سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. جزاكم الله خير.